The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert as Ayanna crouched behind a cluster of prickly pear cactus, her dark eyes scanning the horizon. At 17, she had learned to read the land like others read books. Every bird call, every shift in the wind, every track in the sand told a story. Today, the story was one of desperation. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar companion these past 3 days. The drought had lasted longer than anyone remembered, forcing her small Apache band to scatter in search of food and water. Ayanna had been separated from her family during a dust storm 2 weeks ago, and despite her tracking skills, she had found no trace of them. The leather pouch at her side held only a few dried berries and a small piece of jerky that she was saving for absolute necessity. Her water gourd was nearly empty, containing maybe 2 mouthfuls of the precious liquid. She knew she could not survive much longer alone in this harsh landscape. As she studied the terrain ahead, movement caught her eye. Smoke rose from a valley about 2 miles to the east. Where there was smoke, there were people. Where there were people, there might be food. But there might also be danger. Ayanna had heard stories from the elders about the Choctaw people who lived in the eastern territories. They were known as skilled hunters and fierce warriors, but they were also said to be different from her own people in their ways and customs. Some stories spoke of their generosity to strangers, while others warned of their suspicion of outsiders. She weighed her options carefully. She could continue searching for her own people, but with each passing day her strength was fading. The desert was unforgiving, and she had already pushed her survival skills to their limits. Or she could approach the Choctaw camp and hope for mercy. The decision was made for her when she spotted a rattlesnake coiled near a small water seep she had been approaching. Too weak to properly defend herself and too thirsty to find another water source, she realized her choices had narrowed to one. Gathering her courage, Ayanna began the trek toward the smoke. The sun climbed higher, beating down on her with relentless intensity. Her moccasins, worn thin from weeks of travel, offered little protection against the sharp stones and thorns that littered her path. As she drew closer to the valley, she could make out the shapes of several teepees and lean-to structures, the sound of voices carried on the wind, speaking in a language she did not understand. Her heart pounded as she realized there was no turning back now. The camp was larger than she had expected, with at least 30 people visible from her vantage point on the ridge. Men worked on weapons and tools while women tended to cooking fires and children played nearby. It looked peaceful enough, but Ayanna knew that appearances could be deceiving. She watched for nearly an hour, studying the patterns of movement, identifying who seemed to be the leaders, and looking for the best approach. Her Apache training had taught her the importance of observation before action. Finally, knowing that delay would only weaken her further, Ayanna stood up slowly and began walking down the slope toward the camp. She kept her hands visible and her movements deliberate, hoping to show that she came in peace. The first person to notice her was a young boy gathering firewood at the edge of camp. His eyes widened in surprise and he dropped his bundle of sticks before running toward the center of the settlement, calling out in his native tongue. Within moments, several warriors emerged from the camp, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. Ayanna stopped walking and raised her hands, showing she carried no bow or lance. She stood perfectly still as the men approached, their faces stern and watchful. The leader of the group was a tall man with graying hair and intelligent eyes. He spoke to her in Choctaw, but when she did not respond, he tried a few words in Spanish, then in broken Apache. His accent was thick, but she understood enough to know he was asking who she was and why she had come. In her limited knowledge of trade languages, Ayanna managed to convey that she was alone, hungry, and seeking help. The man's expression remained neutral as he listened, but she caught a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been sympathy. Other people from the camp had gathered now, forming a circle around the small group. Women clutched their children closer while older men muttered among themselves. Ayanna could feel their suspicion and fear, but also their curiosity. The leader gestured for her to follow him toward the center of camp. As they walked, Ayanna noticed how well organized everything was. Drying racks held strips of meat and fish, water containers were arranged neatly near each dwelling, and tools were carefully maintained and stored. They stopped before a large teepee where an elderly woman sat working on a beaded necklace. The leader spoke to her rapidly in Choctaw, and Ayanna caught the tone of respect in his voice. This woman was clearly someone of importance, perhaps the leader's mother or a respected elder. The old woman looked up at Ayanna with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. She studied the young Apache girl from head to toe, taking in her worn clothing, thin frame, and the determined set of her shoulders despite her obvious exhaustion. After what felt like an eternity, the elderly woman spoke. Her words were directed at the leader, but her eyes remained on Ayanna. The conversation that followed was rapid and intense, with several other adults joining in. Though Ayanna could not understand the words, she could read the body language and tone well enough to know they were debating what to do with her. Some voices seemed to argue for sending her away, while others appeared more sympathetic to her plight. The discussion continued for several minutes while Ayanna stood silently, swaying slightly from exhaustion and the heat of the sun. Finally, the elderly woman held up her hand for silence. She spoke a few quiet words to the leader, who nodded solemnly. Then she looked directly at Ayanna and spoke in heavily accented but understandable Apache. The words that would change everything came simply, "You work, you eat. You no work, you leave." The old woman gestured toward a pile of corn that needed husking. "Show us what Apache girl can do." Ayanna felt a surge of relief mixed with determination. She had been given a chance, but she understood that it came with conditions. In this Choctaw camp, nothing would be given freely. Every meal would need to be earned. Every night's shelter would require proof of her worth. As she walked toward the corn pile, Ayanna caught sight of several large birds circling high overhead. Vultures, waiting patiently for weakness to claim another victim of the harsh wilderness. She picked up an ear of corn and began to work, knowing that her survival now depended entirely on her ability to prove herself useful to these strangers who held her life in their hands. The first week in the Choctaw camp tested every skill Ayanna had ever learned. Her hands, accustomed to different tools and methods, struggled with the unfamiliar tasks she was given. The corn husking had been just the beginning. Each dawn brought new challenges and the constant pressure of proving her worth. The elderly woman, whom others called Grandmother Oshi, had become Ayanna's unofficial supervisor. Though her words were few, her expectations were clear. There was no room for weakness or complaint in this arrangement. Ayanna quickly learned that the old woman missed nothing, watching her work with eagle eyes that caught every mistake and hesitation. On the third day, Ayanna was assigned to help with water collection. The nearest reliable spring was a mile walk through rocky terrain, and the water containers were heavy clay pots that required careful handling. She watched the other women balance these vessels with practiced ease, some carrying two at once. When Ayanna attempted to lift her first pot, she underestimated its weight when full. The container slipped from her grip and shattered on the rocks, precious water seeping into the ground. The silence that followed was deafening. Several women looked at her with expressions ranging from annoyance to pity. Grandmother Oshi appeared at her side without making a sound. The old woman examined the broken pottery, then looked at Ayanna with disappointment clear in her weathered face. In her broken Apache, she said, "Clumsy hands make empty bellies." That evening, Ayanna received only half her usual portion of food. The lesson was harsh but effective. Ayanna spent the next morning practicing with empty containers until she could carry them confidently. She studied how the Choctaw women moved, how they positioned their bodies to balance the weight, how they navigated the uneven path without spilling a drop. By the end of her first week, Ayanna had begun to understand the rhythm of camp life. The hunters left before dawn, while the women gathered food, prepared meals, and maintained the camp. Children helped with simple tasks and played games that taught them survival skills. Everyone had a role and everyone contributed. But Ayanna also sensed an undercurrent of tension regarding her presence. Some of the younger warriors watched her with suspicious eyes, muttering among themselves when they thought she could not see. She caught fragments of conversations and realized they questioned whether feeding an outsider was wise when resources were already strained. The camp leader, who she learned was called Chief Abieka, seemed to tolerate her presence but showed no warmth. He spoke to her only when necessary, giving instructions through gestures or simple trade words. His son, a warrior named Chito, was openly hostile, making no effort to hide his resentment at having to share resources with an Apache. It was Chito who presented Ayanna with her greatest challenge yet. On her 8th day in camp, he approached her while she was gathering firewood and spoke in slow, Deliberate Apache words he had obviously learned just for this conversation. "Apache girl thinks she can take Choctaw food and give nothing back," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You eat like warrior but work like weak child. Maybe time to feed the vultures instead." Ayanna straightened, meeting his gaze steadily despite the fear that clutched her heart. She had seen the vultures circling every day, constant reminders of what awaited those who could not survive in this harsh land. But she had also learned something important during her time in the camp. "I work every day," she replied in her careful mix of Apache and trade language. "I learn Choctaw ways." "I make no trouble," Cheeto laughed harshly. "Learning is not enough. Anyone can learn. Can Apache girl hunt? Can she bring meat to feed families? Or does she only know how to gather plants like old women?" The challenge was clear, and Ayanna knew that others were listening. This moment would determine whether she continued to earn her place or found herself cast out to face the desert alone. She thought of her father's teachings, of the countless hours spent learning to track and hunt in the Apache way. "I can hunt," she said simply. Cheeto's smile was predatory. "Then prove it. Tomorrow you come with hunting party. If you bring back meat, you stay. If you bring back nothing, you leave camp forever." That night, Ayanna lay on her thin blanket staring at the stars, her mind racing. She had boasted that she could hunt. But hunting in familiar Apache territory with known prey was very different from hunting in Choctaw, lands with their methods and targets. She spent the sleepless hours reviewing everything she had observed about the local animal signs, the tracks around the water sources, the flight patterns of birds, the places where deer trails converged. She mentally cataloged every lesson her father had taught her about reading the land and predicting animal behavior. Before dawn, she quietly rose and checked her few possessions. Her father's knife was still sharp, and she had fashioned a simple bow from materials gathered around the camp. It was not as fine as the weapons the Choctaw hunters carried, but it would have to suffice. The hunting party assembled as the first light touched the eastern hills. 5 warriors, including Cheeto, prepared their gear with practiced efficiency. They looked at Ayanna with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. She was clearly an afterthought to their plans. Chief Abieka appeared and spoke briefly with his son. Though the words were in Choctaw, Ayanna caught enough to understand that the chief was giving his son permission to test her. But she also heard a warning tone that suggested Cheeto should not make the test unfairly difficult. As they set out from camp, Ayanna positioned herself at the back of the group, where she could observe without getting in the way. The Choctaw hunters moved differently than Apache warriors, but their skills were obviously honed by years of experience. They communicated with hand signals and read tracks with expert eyes. For the first hour, they followed a well-worn game trail through scrub oak and pine. Ayanna noted how the Choctaw hunters worked together, each man knowing his role without discussion. They were tracking a small herd of deer that had passed through the area recently. When they reached a clearing where several trails intersected, the lead hunter called a halt. He studied the ground carefully, then spoke quietly with the others. After a brief discussion, Cheeto approached Ayanna. "Deer went 3 ways," he said, pointing to different trails leading from the clearing. "We take main trail. You choose different path. Meet back here when sun is straight up. Bring meat, or do not come back at all." Ayanna nodded, understanding that she was being isolated from the group's coordinated hunt. She would have to rely entirely on her own skills and luck. As the other hunters disappeared down the main trail, she examined the remaining options. The second trail showed signs of a single deer, probably a young buck based on the hoof size and stride length. The third trail was fainter, but showed multiple animals passing through, possibly including does with fawns based on the smaller prints mixed with larger ones. After considering her options, Ayanna chose the third trail. It would be more challenging to approach multiple animals without spooking them, but if successful, she might have more than one target. She also hoped that a group of deer might include younger animals that would be easier to bring down with her simple weapon. The trail led uphill through increasingly thick forest. Ayanna moved carefully, testing each step to avoid breaking twigs or disturbing loose stones. She paused frequently to listen and scan for movement ahead. The morning was still cool, but she could feel sweat beading on her forehead from the tension of the hunt. After an hour of careful tracking, she caught the sound of water flowing over rocks. A stream lay ahead, and where there was water, there would likely be animals coming to drink. She approached the sound with extra caution, knowing that this might be her best opportunity. Through the trees, she could see a small meadow with a clear stream running through it. 3 deer grazed peacefully near the water's edge, 2 does and a yearling. Perfect targets for her simple bow, if she could get close enough for a clean shot. Ayanna studied the wind direction and the layout of the meadow. She would need to circle around to approach from downwind, using a fallen log as cover for the final approach. The shot would be difficult but not impossible if she could get within 30 yards. Moving like a shadow, she began her careful stalk toward the most important hunt of her life. The stalk toward the drinking deer took Ayanna nearly an hour. Every movement had to be calculated, every step tested before committing her full weight. The fallen log she had chosen for cover was 40 yards from the nearest doe, still at the edge of her bow's effective range, but it was the closest she could get without being spotted. As she settled into position behind the weathered trunk, Ayanna's heart hammered so loudly she was certain the deer would hear it. She had hunted many times with her father and brothers, but never with so much depending on the outcome. This was not just about bringing meat back to feed her family. This was about earning the right to survive. The yearling deer lifted its head suddenly, ears twitching as it sensed something amiss. Ayanna froze completely, not even daring to breathe. For long moments, the young deer stared in her general direction, while the 2 does continued grazing peacefully. Finally, satisfied that no threat existed, the yearling lowered its head back to the sweet grass near the stream's edge. Ayanna slowly drew her bow, the simple weapon creaking softly as she pulled the sinew string back to her cheek. She had made the arrows herself from straight shoots, fletched with hawk feathers she had found around the Choctaw camp. The stone points were napped in the Apache style her father had taught her, but the materials were unfamiliar and she was unsure how they would fly. She chose the yearling as her target, reasoning that it would provide substantial meat while being easier to bring down than the larger, more experienced does. Taking aim just behind the front shoulder where the arrow would find the heart, Ayanna held her breath and released. The arrow flew true, striking the yearling exactly where she had aimed. The young deer leaped once, then collapsed as its companions bolted into the forest. Ayanna remained motionless behind the log for several minutes, listening to make sure no other dangers were approaching, before emerging to examine her kill. The yearling had died quickly and cleanly. As Ayanna knelt beside the animal, she whispered a prayer of gratitude in the Apache way, thanking the deer's spirit for giving its life so that she might live. Then she began the practical work of field dressing the carcass, using her father's knife with practiced efficiency. The work was messy and difficult without help, but Ayanna had done it many times before. She removed the internal organs carefully, burying them away from the stream to avoid contaminating the water. She kept the heart and liver, knowing they were prized by hunters and would help demonstrate her skill to the Choctaw warriors. Loading the dressed deer onto her shoulders was more challenging than she had anticipated. The animal was heavier than it had looked, and she was already weakened by weeks of poor nutrition and hard work. But determination drove her forward as she began the trek back to the meeting place. The sun was approaching its zenith when Ayanna finally reached the clearing where the trails converged. She arrived to find the 5 Choctaw hunters already waiting, their own hunt apparently unsuccessful. They sat in the shade of a large oak tree, sharing water and dried meat while they discussed their morning in low voices. When Ayanna emerged from the forest with the yearling across her shoulders, the conversation stopped abruptly. Chito rose to his feet, his expression shifting from confident superiority to something approaching disbelief. The other warriors gathered around as Ayanna lowered her burden to the ground. The lead hunter, a grizzled man named Tanuk, examined the deer carcass with professional interest. He noted the clean arrow wound, the expert field dressing, and the careful treatment of the meat. When he looked up at Ayanna, there was new respect in his eyes. "Good shot," he said in broken Apache. "Clean kill. No waste." Chito said nothing, but his jaw was tight with barely controlled anger. He had clearly expected Ayanna to return empty-handed and humiliated, ready to accept banishment from the camp. Instead, she had succeeded where his own hunting party had failed. The journey back to camp was different from the morning's departure. Ayanna walked with the group now rather than trailing behind, and the warriors included her in their conversations through gestures and simple words. They were professional enough to recognize skill when they saw it, regardless of its source. News of Ayana's successful hunt spread quickly through the camp. By the time the hunting party arrived, a crowd had gathered to see the Apache girl, who had brought back meat when the experienced Choctaw hunters had not. Women examined the deer with knowing eyes, nodding approvingly at the clean work and careful handling. Grandmother Oshi pushed through the crowd to stand before Ayana. The old woman studied the deer, then looked up at the young Apache girl with an expression Ayana had never seen before, something that might have been pride mixed with calculation. Apache girl hunts like warrior, the grandmother said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Brings meat when others bring empty hands. She paused, letting her words sink in. Tonight, Apache girl eats first portion, shows respect to hunter who feeds camp. The crowd murmured at this pronouncement. Being offered the first portion was an honor typically reserved for the most successful hunters or respected elders. For an outsider to receive such recognition was unprecedented. That evening, as the venison roasted over the central fire, Ayana found herself in an unfamiliar position. Instead of waiting to see if there would be enough food left for her, she was invited to sit with the successful hunters and help herself first. The meat was tender and flavorful, seasoned with herbs she did not recognize but found delicious. Chief Abieka approached her as she ate, settling down beside her with the deliberate movements of an older warrior. He spoke in careful, measured words that mixed Choctaw, Apache, and trade language. "My son thought to shame you today," he said quietly. "Instead, you brought honor to his hunting party. This teaches important lesson about judging others too quickly." Ayana nodded, understanding that she was receiving more than just acknowledgement of her hunting success. The chief was telling her that she had earned a new level of acceptance in the camp. "I learn much from Choctaw people," she replied in her improving mixture of languages. "Good teachers make good students." The chief smiled at this diplomatic response. "Tomorrow you hunt again, but not alone. You learn our ways of group hunting. Show us Apache methods. We learn from each other." As the evening progressed, Ayana noticed subtle changes in how others treated her. Children who had previously watched her with curious eyes now approached to ask questions about Apache hunting methods. Women included her in conversations about the best ways to preserve meat and prepare hides. Even some of the younger warriors seemed less suspicious, asking about tracking techniques and arrow making. Only Chito remained openly hostile, though he was careful not to challenge her directly in front of his father. Ayana caught him watching her with calculating eyes and knew that he had not accepted his defeat gracefully. She would need to remain vigilant around him. But for the first time since arriving at the Choctaw camp, Ayana felt something approaching security. She had proven her worth in terms that even her harshest critics could not dismiss. The vultures that had circled overhead for weeks were no longer waiting for her to falter. She had shown that she could not only survive but contribute to the survival of others. As she settled down to sleep that night, Ayana reflected on how much her life had changed. 3 weeks ago, she had been a lost Apache girl facing starvation in the desert. Now she was a recognized hunter in a Choctaw camp, earning her place through skill and determination rather than charity. She thought of her family, wondering if they were safe and whether she would ever see them again. But for the first time in weeks, that uncertainty did not fill her with despair. She had learned that she could adapt and survive in unfamiliar circumstances. Whatever the future held, she would face it with confidence in her abilities and the knowledge that she could earn respect even among strangers. The stars wheeled overhead as the camp settled into sleep, and Ayana closed her eyes knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the trust that was slowly being placed in her. 3 weeks after her successful solo hunt, Ayana had settled into a routine that felt almost natural. She rose before dawn with the other hunters, helped prepare the morning meal, and spent her days learning the intricate teamwork that made Choctaw hunting parties so effective. Her Apache methods, once viewed with suspicion, were now sought after as the hunters discovered how her different approach could complement their traditional techniques. The integration had not been without its challenges. Chito continued to undermine her whenever possible, assigning her the most difficult tasks during hunts and criticizing her methods in front of the other warriors. But his father's protection and her consistent results had gradually won over most of the camp members. On this particular morning, however, something was different. Ayana sensed tension in the air as she helped load hunting gear. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and several of the older warriors wore expressions of concern. When she asked Tanak what was troubling everyone, he hesitated before answering. "Scouts found tracks yesterday," he said finally. "Apache war party, maybe 20 warriors moving through the valley to the south. Chief Abika must decide what to do." Ayana's heart clenched. Apache warriors in this area could mean several things, none of them simple. They might be her own people searching for her, which would be wonderful but could create conflict with her Choctaw hosts. They might be from a different Apache band altogether, possibly hostile to both her and the Choctaw. Or they might be raiders seeking to take what they needed from any available target. Chief Abika called a council meeting that excluded the women and younger warriors. But Ayana could see the serious faces of the men as they gathered around the central fire. She went about her morning tasks with growing anxiety, knowing that whatever decision was made would directly affect her future. When the meeting broke up, Grandmother Oshi summoned Ayana to her side. The old woman's weathered face was thoughtful as she spoke in her careful mixture of Apache and Choctaw words. "Apache warriors come close to our territory," she said. "Chief must know their intentions. Are they looking for lost girl? Are they seeking war? Are they just passing through our lands?" Ayana nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. "What does the chief want me to do?" "He wants you to go with scouting party. Your eyes know Apache signs better than ours. You can tell us what kind of warriors these are and what they seek." The implications of this request were enormous. The Choctaw were trusting her to help them gather intelligence about her own people, potentially putting her in a position where she might have to choose sides. But refusing would likely mean losing all the trust and acceptance she had worked so hard to build. "I will go," she said simply. The scouting party consisted of 4 experienced Choctaw warriors led by Tanak, with Ayana as their guide to Apache customs and behaviors. They traveled light, carrying only water, dried meat, and weapons needed for defense if discovered. Their mission was to observe and report back, not to engage unless absolutely necessary. The Apache tracks were easy to follow once they reached the area the original scouts had marked. 20 warriors, as Tanak had said, but Ayana could read additional details in the signs they left behind. The horses were well fed and cared for, suggesting this was not a desperate raiding party. The warriors had taken time to rest and graze their mounts, indicating they were not fleeing from pursuit. Most importantly, they were traveling in a loose formation that suggested confidence rather than the tight defensive posture of a war party expecting trouble. "These are not raiders," Ayana told Tanak as they studied a campsite from the previous night. "They move like hunters or travelers. See how they built fire in open area? War party would hide flames better." Tanak nodded, trusting her expertise in reading the signs of her own people. "But why do they come to Choctaw territory? Are they lost?" Ayana studied the tracks more carefully, looking for clues about the warriors' origins and destination. The horses' hoof prints showed wear patterns she recognized, and one of the warriors had distinctive boot prints that stirred a memory. "I think I know some of these men," she said quietly. "If I am right, they are from my father's band. They may be searching for survivors of our group." This revelation changed everything. If these Apache warriors were indeed looking for Ayana, their mission was rescue rather than raid. But it also meant that finding her living peacefully with the Choctaw might create diplomatic complications that neither side wanted. The scouting party followed the Apache trail for another day, staying far enough back to avoid detection while gathering more information. Ayana's reading of the signs proved accurate. This was clearly a search party rather than a war band. They were checking every water source and shelter, looking for traces of missing people. On the second evening, they finally spotted the Apache camp in a sheltered canyon about 10 miles from Choctaw territory. Using skills learned from both cultures, Ayana crept close enough to observe the warriors around their fire. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized her older brother Kuruk among them, along with several other men she had known since childhood. She retreated to where the Choctaw scouts waited and confirmed what she had suspected. "They are my people," she whispered. "My brother leads them. They search for survivors from our band, including me." Tanak's expression was troubled. "This makes situation very difficult. If we let them find you, they will want to take you home. If we hide your presence, they may think Choctaw killed you and seek revenge." Ayana had been grappling with the same dilemma. Her Apache family would never understand why she had stayed with the Choctaw by choice, rather than seeking them out. They would assume she had been captured or coerced, potentially leading to conflict between the two groups. There is third option, she said slowly. I could meet with them and explain situation myself. Show them I am safe and choosing to remain with Choctaw friends. But this would require great trust from Chief Abieka. The return journey to the Choctaw camp took on new urgency. Tanakh pushed the pace, knowing that important decisions needed to be made quickly before the Apache search. Party came closer to discovering their location. Chief Abieka listened to their report with the stoic expression of a leader weighing difficult choices. When Ayanna finished explaining her relationship to the Apache warriors and her proposed solution, he sat in thoughtful silence for long minutes. You would risk your life to prevent conflict between our peoples, he said finally. Apache warriors might think you lie to protect us. They might try to take you by force. They are my family, Ayanna replied. They will listen to me if I speak truth. But I understand the danger. I ask only for chance to try peaceful solution before other options are considered. Grandmother Oshi, who had been listening quietly from her usual place near the fire, spoke up. Girl has earned right to choose her own path. She proved herself hunter and protector of our people. If she wants to face her brother and speak truth, we should trust her wisdom. Chito, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, finally voiced his opposition. This could be trap. Apache girl could be planning to betray us all along. She could lead her warriors directly to our camp. Chief Abieka looked at his son with disappointment. After all this time, you still do not trust someone who has proven herself repeatedly? Your judgment is clouded by pride and jealousy. The rebuke stung, but Chito fell silent under his father's stern gaze. After more discussion, the chief made his decision. Tomorrow, Ayanna will approach her brother under flag of truce. Tanakh and 2 other warriors will escort her part way, staying close enough to provide help if needed, but far enough to avoid provoking the Apache. If peaceful solution is possible, we will pursue it. If not, he left the alternative unspoken, but everyone understood. That night, Ayanna lay awake considering what she would say to Kuruk and the other warriors. How could she explain that she had found a new family among former strangers? How could she make them understand that she had chosen to stay not out of fear or coercion, but because she had discovered a place where her skills were valued and her contributions mattered? The stars wheeled overhead as she wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Tomorrow would determine not only her own future, but potentially the relationship between 2 proud peoples who had more in common than they realized. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy blanket, but she knew she had to try. Dawn would come soon, and with it the most important conversation of her young life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Ayanna approached the Apache camp, her heart pounding with each step. Tanakh and his warriors had positioned themselves on a ridge nearly a mile away, close enough to intervene if things went wrong, but far enough to avoid appearing threatening. The white cloth tied to a lance shaft in her hand served as the universal sign of peaceful intentions. She had dressed carefully for this meeting, wearing her original Apache clothing that she had kept clean and mended during her time with the Choctaw. But she also carried items that told the story of her recent experiences. A Choctaw-made water gourd, arrows fletched in the style she had learned from Grandmother Oshi, and the knife her Apache father had given her, now worn smooth from weeks of use in service to her adopted people. The Apache sentries spotted her while she was still half a mile from their camp. 2 warriors rode out to meet her, their faces showing the mix of suspicion and curiosity that any unexpected visitor would provoke. When they got close enough to see her features clearly, both men pulled up their horses in shock. Ayanna, the younger warrior's voice cracked with disbelief. Little sister, is it really you? She recognized him as Bidzi, one of her brother's closest friends since childhood. The older warrior was Nalnish, a respected tracker whose skills had clearly been essential in following her trail this far. It is me, Bidzi, she said, raising her free hand in the traditional Apache greeting. I come in peace to speak with my brother. Both warriors stared at her as if she were a spirit returned from the dead. Nalnish dismounted and approached slowly, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance. We thought you were dead, child. The dust storm scattered everyone, and when we could not find your trail, he shook his head. Kuruk has blamed himself for losing you. He has searched for weeks. I am not lost, Ayanna said carefully. I am exactly where I choose to be, but I must speak with Kuruk and explain. Will you take me to him? Bidsy's expression darkened as he noticed the foreign elements in her clothing and equipment. You carry Choctaw-made items. Have they held you prisoner? Did they force you to work for them? No one has forced me to do anything. I will explain everything, but only to Kuruk. He leads this party, and he deserves to hear the truth first. The two warriors exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to handle this unexpected development. Finally, Nalnish nodded toward his horse. Ride with me. But know that if this is some Choctaw trick, it will not go well for anyone involved. The short ride to the Apache camp felt like the longest journey of Ayana's life. Warriors emerged from shelters and gathered around cooking fires as word spread that the lost girl had returned. Their faces showed joy mixed with confusion as they saw her healthy appearance and the foreign items she carried. Kuruk emerged from the largest shelter at the center of camp, his face showing the strain of weeks of searching and self-recrimination. When he saw Ayana, his expression went through a series of rapid changes: relief, joy, confusion, and finally concern as he took in the details of her appearance. "Little sister," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We feared the worst when the storm separated us. Where have you been? Who has cared for you?" Ayana dismounted and walked toward her brother, aware that every eye in the camp was upon her. This moment would determine not only her own future but potentially the fate of the peaceful relationship she hoped to preserve between the Apache and Choctaw peoples. "I have been with the Choctaw," she said simply. "They found me when I was dying of thirst and hunger. They gave me food, shelter, and purpose. I have chosen to remain with them." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Kuruk's face went through several expressions before settling on disbelief. "Chosen? Ayana, you are Apache. Your place is with your own people, with your family. Whatever they have told you, whatever they have done to make you think, they have done nothing except treat me with fairness and respect," Ayana interrupted. "I have earned my place among them through my own skills and work. I hunt with their warriors, contribute to their survival, and am valued for what I can offer." Bidsy stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "This is Choctaw trickery. They have poisoned her mind somehow, made her forget who she really is." "My mind is clear," Ayana said firmly. "I remember exactly who I am and where I come from. But I also know who I have become and what I have learned. The Choctaw are not our enemies, brother. They are skilled hunters and generous people who judge others by their actions rather than their birth." Kuruk's expression hardened. "You speak like someone who has forgotten the blood of our ancestors, the traditions of our people. How can you choose strangers over family?" The accusation stung, but Ayana had expected it. "I have not forgotten anything. I carry our father's knife, speak our language, remember our stories. But I have also learned that survival sometimes requires adaptation. When I was alone and dying, the Choctaw offered me a chance to live. All they asked in return was that I prove my worth through work and contribution." "And what happens when they tire of you?" Nalnish asked. "What happens when resources become scarce and they decide the Apache girl is expendable?" "The same thing that happens to anyone who cannot contribute," Ayana replied honestly. "The desert does not care about bloodlines or tribal loyalty. It only cares about strength, skill, and the will to survive. The Choctaw understand this truth." Kuruk walked closer to his sister, studying her face as if looking for signs of coercion or madness. "You are healthy," he said finally. "Well-fed, strong. They have treated you well. Better than well. They have treated me as an equal once I proved myself worthy of it." "Then come home with us," Kuruk pleaded. "If you have learned valuable things from the Choctaw, you can teach them to our people. Your experience will make you a better Apache, not a replacement for one." This was the moment Ayana had dreaded most. She loved her brother and missed her family terribly. But she had also discovered something among the Choctaw that she had never expected to find. A place where her individual worth mattered more than her family connections or tribal status. "I cannot come with you, brother," she said quietly. "My life is with the Choctaw now. They have become my family too." The camp erupted in angry voices. Several warriors demanded to know what kind of spell the Choctaw had cast over her, while others suggested immediate action to rescue her from whatever influence had corrupted her thinking. Kuruk raised his hand for silence, his face a mask of pain and confusion. "You would abandon your blood family for strangers?" he asked. "I would honor the family that saved my life and gave me purpose when my blood family could not," Ayana replied. "That does not mean I love you less, only that I have learned love can grow beyond the boundaries we think limit it." The standoff stretched for long minutes with neither side willing to back down. Finally, an older warrior named Hastian stepped forward. He was one of the most respected men in their band, known for his wisdom and fair judgment. "Let the girl speak more of these Choctaw," he said. "If they are as honorable as she claims, perhaps this situation is not as simple as we first thought." Ayanna seized the opportunity to tell them more about her experiences, the fair treatment she had received, the skills she had learned, the respect she had earned through her own efforts. She described the hunting successes, the way conflicts were resolved through discussion rather than force, and the practical cooperation that made the Choctaw camp function efficiently. As she spoke, she could see some of the warriors beginning to reconsider their initial assumptions. These were practical men who understood the value of survival skills and effective leadership. The picture she painted of Choctaw society was not one of enemies to be feared, but of potential allies to be respected. "If these people are so worthy," Hastian said when she finished, "perhaps it would be valuable to meet them ourselves, to see with our own eyes whether your words match reality." Kuruk looked startled at this suggestion. "You would trust Choctaw warriors not to attack us?" "I would trust my sister to arrange a meeting that serves the interests of both peoples," Hastian replied. "If she has truly found a place of honor among them, they will listen to her counsel about how to approach us peacefully." Ayanna felt a surge of hope. This was more than she had dared to expect. Not just acceptance of her choice, but the possibility of creating understanding between the two groups. "The Choctaw leaders are wise and practical," she said. "If they can be convinced that cooperation serves their interest better than conflict, they will choose peace. But it must be approached carefully, with respect for their customs and acknowledgement of their strength." The discussion that followed was intense, but more thoughtful than the initial emotional reactions. Gradually, a plan began to emerge that might satisfy everyone's needs while honoring the concerns of both sides. The meeting between the Apache and Choctaw leaders took place 3 days later, in a neutral valley between their territories. Ayanna had worked tirelessly to arrange the details, serving as translator and cultural interpreter for both sides. The site she chose was symbolic, a place where a natural spring provided water for any traveler, regardless of their tribal affiliation. Chief Abika arrived with 5 of his most trusted warriors, including Tanak but notably excluding Chito, whose hostility toward the arrangement was well known. Kuruk brought an equal number of Apache warriors, with Hastian serving as his advisor and voice of wisdom. Both groups came armed but with weapons peace-bonded, showing their intention to talk rather than fight. Ayanna stood between the two groups as they approached each other across the valley floor. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, rehearsing not just the words she would need to translate, but the cultural nuances that could make the difference between success and disaster. The formal greetings were conducted with careful ceremony. Chief Abieka spoke first, welcoming the Apache warriors to Choctaw territory and expressing his hope that they could find peaceful solutions to their concerns. Kuruk responded with equal formality, acknowledging the hospitality and expressing gratitude for the care his sister had received. As the initial pleasantries concluded, Ayanna began the delicate process of helping each side understand the other's perspective. She translated not just words but cultural concepts, explaining Apache customs to the Choctaw and Choctaw practices to the Apache. "My sister tells us you judged her worth by her actions rather than her bloodline," Kuruk said through Ayanna's translation. "This is something our peoples have in common. We too believe that honor must be earned rather than inherited." Chief Abieka nodded approvingly. The Apache girl proved herself a skilled hunter and valuable member of our community. She asked for no special treatment and accepted no charity. Everything she received she earned through her own efforts. As the conversation continued, both sides began to recognize similarities they had not expected. Both peoples valued courage, skill in hunting, and loyalty to family. Both had been shaped by the harsh demands of desert survival. Both understood the importance of practical cooperation in the face of environmental challenges. Hastian raised a question that had been troubling many of the Apache warriors. "If our peoples are so similar, why do you think the girl chose to remain with you rather than seek out her own family?" Chief Abieka considered this carefully before responding. "Perhaps because among us she discovered that family can be more than blood. She found a place where her individual gifts were recognized and valued. Sometimes the family we choose is as important as the family we are born into. Ayanna felt tears threatening as she translated these words. The Choctaw chief had perfectly captured what she had struggled to explain to her brother, that her choice was not a rejection of her Apache heritage, but an expansion of her understanding of where she belonged. The discussion turned to practical matters. The Apache band was still searching for other survivors of the dust storm that had scattered their people. The Choctaw had extensive knowledge of the local area and could provide valuable assistance in this search. In return, the Apache possessed skills and resources that could benefit the Choctaw community. What if we were to help each other? Grandmother Oshie suggested, speaking for the first time since the formal greetings. Apache eyes could help us watch for threats from the east. Choctaw knowledge could help Apache find safe water and food sources. Both peoples become stronger through cooperation. The idea was revolutionary, not just tolerance between the two groups, but active collaboration. Ayanna could see both excitement and concern in the faces around her as the implications sank in. Kuruk looked directly at his sister. "And what role would you play in such an arrangement?" "I would serve as bridge between our peoples," Ayanna replied without hesitation. "I understand both cultures now. I could help prevent misunderstandings and facilitate cooperation, but I would do this as a member of the Choctaw community, not as a returned Apache." The words were difficult to speak, but they represented her honest commitment. She had found her place among the Choctaw and would not abandon it, even for the possibility of reunion with her birth family. Kuruk was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with emotions that played across his face. Finally, he spoke with the dignity of a warrior accepting an honorable defeat. "I do not fully understand your choice, little sister, but I see that it comes from your heart rather than from fear or coercion. If this is truly what you want, I will not stand in your way." The negotiations that followed established the framework for unprecedented cooperation between the two groups. Trade agreements, shared hunting territories, and mutual defense pacts were discussed and tentatively agreed upon. The details would need to be worked out over time, but the foundation for peace had been laid. As the formal meeting concluded, Kuruk approached Ayanna for a private conversation. Brother and sister walked to the edge of the spring where they could speak without being overheard. "I still hope you will change your mind," Kuruk said quietly. "Our parents would want to see you again, to know that you are safe and well." "They will know," Ayanna replied. "The trade agreements will bring our peoples together regularly. I will see our family again, but as a visitor rather than as someone returning home." Kuruk nodded, accepting what he could not change. "Then I ask only that you remember who you are and where you came from. Do not let your new life erase your old one completely." "I could never forget," Ayanna assured him. "Everything our father taught me about hunting, everything our mother taught me about strength, everything you taught me about courage, these things made it possible for me to survive and thrive among the Choctaw. I carry our family's legacy with me always." They embraced then, a farewell that was also a blessing. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes, but both also had peace in their hearts. The Apache band departed the next morning, taking with them detailed maps of water sources and game trails that the Choctaw had shared. In return, they left information about potential threats and valuable resources they had discovered during their travels. The first exchange of the new partnership had already begun. Ayanna watched them ride away from the ridge where she had first seen the Choctaw camp smoke so many weeks ago. The vultures that had once circled overhead waiting for her to fail were nowhere to be seen. She had not only survived her ordeal but had created something entirely new, a bridge between worlds that had previously viewed each other with suspicion. As she turned to walk back down into the valley where her chosen family waited, Ayanna reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a lost Apache girl facing starvation and death in the wilderness. She was ending as a respected hunter and diplomat who had helped forge peace between two proud peoples. The Choctaw camp came into view as she reached the bottom of the ridge. Grandmother Oshie waved from her place by the central fire, and Tanak called out a greeting from where he was working on new arrows. Even Cheeto, who had been notably absent from the peace negotiations, nodded acknowledgement of her return. Chief Abieka approached as she entered the camp proper. "The first steps toward peace are often the most difficult," he said. "You have done well, Bridgewalker," the name surprised her. "Bridgewalker?" It is what the council decided to call you, the chief explained. Ayanna is your Apache name given by your birth family, but you have earned a Choctaw name as well, reflecting your role in bringing our peoples together. You walk between worlds, helping each understand the other. Ayanna, Bridgewalker, felt a deep sense of completion at these words. She had not lost her Apache identity by joining the Choctaw. She had expanded it. She was no longer defined by the limitations of a single culture, but by her ability to find value and meaning in multiple traditions. That evening, as the camp settled into its familiar rhythm of preparation for the night, Ayanna sat by the fire working on a new set of arrows. She used techniques learned from both cultures, creating weapons that combined Apache precision with Choctaw durability. The arrows were a perfect metaphor for what she herself had become, something new created from the best elements of different traditions. The stars emerged overhead, the same constellations that had guided her through the desperate weeks of survival that now seemed like a lifetime ago. But she was no longer the same person who had stumbled into this camp, driven by hunger and desperation. She had become someone who chose her own path, who earned her place through merit rather than inheritance, and who had the courage to build bridges where others saw only barriers. The vultures were gone, but Ayanna had learned that survival was about much more than simply avoiding death. True survival meant finding purpose, creating value, and building connections that enriched not just your own life, but the lives of others. In learning to thrive among strangers, she had discovered truths about herself that might have remained hidden if she had never been forced to leave her familiar world behind.